The marriage record still rests in the Louisiana State Archives, yellowed with age and fragile to the touch. It bears the name of Jeremiah Aldrich and beneath it, chillingly, the name of Celeste, marked not as a bride but as property. What makes this document so disturbing isn't only the grotesque union between a wealthy planter and his enslaved cook. It's what came after. 13 unexplained deaths within months of their wedding in March 1854. Local newspapers of the era preserved, in dusty private collections, hint at a conspiracy so deliberate, so cruel, that officials suppressed the truth to protect some of Louisiana's most powerful families. The tale of that coerced marriage unfolds into a story of vengeance, betrayal, and torture so relentless it shook even the violence-hardened Antebellum South. Before we dive into the fate of Jeremiah, Aldrich, and the nightmare that consumed Willowbrook Plantation, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us in the comments what state you're listening from. Your support helps us bring hidden American horrors back into the light. Now, let's return to a world where reputation was currency, and broken trust could destroy a man in ways worse than death. The road to that twisted wedding began nearly 15 years earlier, deep in the Mississippi Delta, place where fortunes were carved from human misery, and blood money flowed as steadily as the river itself. Jeremiah Aldrich hadn't been born into Louisiana's planter aristocracy. He was the son of a failed tobacco farmer in Kentucky. In 1839, he arrived in New Orleans, with little more than sharp ambition and the willingness to take on business ventures too unsavory for polite society. The Creolite liked to pretend their wealth came solely from sugar and cotton. The truth was different, but they kept their hands clean of the slave trade itself. Aldrich, however, had no such illusions. By the sweltering summer of 1840, he had partnered with two equally desperate men, Marcus Deveau, the youngest son of a fading sugar dynasty, and Samuel Rochelle, a ruined sea captain with first-hand knowledge of illegal slave routes from Cuba and the Caribbean. Together, they built the Delta Trading Company, operating from a warehouse on the edges of New Orleans. Far from questions or oversight, their business was more lucrative than they'd ever dared imagine. Unlike licensed traders, they specialized in recovery services. They bought fugitives from bounty hunters, kidnapped free men of color, sold back into bondage, and most profitably smuggled new captives from ships that defied the ban on transatlantic trade. They had no expenses for care or documentation. They treated people as inventory, and profits soared. For 3 years, the trio thrived in the shadows. They laundered their money into legitimate ventures and bought their way into respectability. Deveau saved his plantation and expanded it into a powerhouse of sugar. Rochelle bought a fleet of riverboats and rebranded himself as a shipping magnate. Aldrich purchased Willowbrook Plantation, 40 miles upriver, with a grand mansion that signaled his entry into the planter elite. But success makes men careless, and in 1843, word spread that federal marshals were probing illegal slave operations along the Gulf. Someone had been talking, records were being checked, and freed captives were giving testimony. The three men met in emergency council inside Aldrich's ornate study, a room stuffed with leather-bound books he never read and portraits of ancestors who weren't his. Deveau panicked, arguing they should burn records and dissolve the company. Rochelle, ever the sailor, urged patience, a shift of assets offshore until the heat died down, but Aldrich had already chosen another path. He would kill them both, claim survivors' innocence, and seize their fortunes. The plan was cold, methodical, and evil in its simplicity. On a humid June evening in 1843, the partners gathered one last time in their warehouse headquarters. Aldrich arrived early, pistol hidden in his coat, a skinning knife in his boot, and hired dockside witnesses ready to swear they'd seen his partners arguing over stolen money. At first, the meeting unfolded like any other. Whiskey flowed, accounts were reviewed, and strategies debated. But Rochelle, seasoned by years of dangerous ports, noticed Aldrich's unease. The way his hand strayed toward his coat pocket. He suggested postponing until their lawyers were present. That was Aldrich's signal. With no hesitation, he pulled the pistol and fired into Devo's chest. The young man toppled backward in shock, blood blooming across his shirt. But Rochelle didn't fold so easily. He flipped the table, shattered a bottle, and slashed Aldrich across the cheek, leaving a scar that would mark him forever. What followed was not the swift execution Aldrich envisioned, but a brutal, 10-minute struggle for survival. Rochelle fought like a man who knew exactly what was happening and refused to die quietly. The warehouse echoed with the violence of their struggle. Crates splintered, ledgers scattered across the floor. Blood smeared onto every surface as they wrestled for control of the knife Aldrich had drawn from his boot. But time was not on Rochelle's side. At 53, his body could not match the strength and stamina of the younger man. With a savage twist, Aldrich drove the blade deep into Rochelle's stomach, wrenching it upward toward his chest as the old sailor clawed desperately at his throat. Even as the life drained from him, Rochelle rasped out words that would echo in Aldrich's mind for years to come. "My boy knows everything. He'll come for you. When he's grown, he'll make you pay." At the time, Aldrich dismissed the dying man's threat as delirium. He could not have known that Marcus Deveau's younger brother, Philippe, had already been keeping meticulous records of their dealings, or that Rochelle's 17-year-old son, Henri, had memorized every contact, every shipment, every dirty ledger from the Delta Trading Company's 3-year reign of blood. For the next 4 hours, Aldrich staged the crime scene with calculated precision. He propped Deveau's body to suggest he'd been shot while reaching for a weapon. He positioned Rochelle nearby, knife in hand, with defensive wounds carefully carved to imply a desperate struggle. He scattered bills across the floor as though money had triggered their downfall, dented the office safe to hint at robbery, and even cut his own hands to complete the illusion of survival. The witnesses Aldrich had purchased played their roles perfectly. Dock workers testified that Deveau and Rochelle had argued violently about missing money earlier that day. A corrupt laborer swore he heard shouting, then gunfire, from the warehouse. And Aldrich's rehearsed account claiming he had arrived only to mediate, and was dragged into their fatal quarrel, fit neatly into the story. New Orleans police, burdened with more urgent crimes, and reluctant to probe too deeply into the affairs of men who carried a veneer of respectability, accepted the tale without much effort. The report concluded that Deveau and Rochelle had killed each other over money, and Aldrich had barely survived. Within a week, the warehouse was demolished, erasing the last physical trace of their true operations. With his partners dead, Aldrich moved with ruthless speed. He presented forged contracts, naming him sole heir to the partnership, documents signed by the deceased men themselves. Banks that had once hesitated at the strange trio now welcomed a single, established planter. Within months, Aldrich drained every account, seized every deed, and collected nearly $40,000 in assets, wealth that today would equal millions. And yet, in securing his empire, Aldrich overlooked a danger greater than federal marshals: the families of the men he had butchered. He had silenced the partners, but not the sons, who carried their blood and their secrets. Philippe Deveau was just 22 when his brother Marcus died, but unlike Marcus, Philippe possessed patience and a cold, calculating mind. He had been the quiet architect behind the partnership's books, maintaining coded ledgers of every illegal transaction, slave purchases, forbidden shipping routes, and letters with corrupt officials. He had never trusted Aldrich. There was something about the Kentuckian's eagerness to wallow in brutality that seemed excessive, even for traffickers in human flesh. When news of Marcus's death reached the family plantation, Philippe's grief quickly hardened into icy fury. The official version, that two cautious businessmen had slain each other in a drunken fight, was laughable to anyone who knew them. Marcus would never have risked everything in a reckless brawl. Rochelle was pragmatic, a sailor who solved disputes with negotiation, not blood. And Aldrich's testimony included details Philippe knew were outright lies, references to money that had already been moved, and accounts that no longer existed. Within days of the funeral, Philippe began his own investigation. He bribed dock workers, pieced together shipping manifests, and slipped coins into the hands of policemen willing to talk. What emerged was unmistakable. The crime scene had been staged, the testimony purchased, the evidence buried, and most damning of all, Aldrich had accessed his partner's accounts almost immediately, revealing forethought rather than survival. Meanwhile, across the river, Henri Rochelle launched his own inquiry. He had inherited his father's sea-hardened instincts, but combined them with a formal education in law and business, while Philippe hunted for the truth through the streets and docks. Henri hunted it in bank ledgers, property records, and notarized transfers. He traced Aldrich's theft with surgical precision, documenting how he had stripped the partnership of over $60,000 in cash, property, and investments. Henri, however, understood something Philippe did not. Louisiana's courts were corrupt, and justice through law was an illusion. If Aldrich were to be undone, it would not be through trials. It would be through his own greed, turned back upon him. And so Henri began planning not for immediate revenge, but for a reckoning so devastating, Aldrich would wish death had found him in that warehouse. The two young men finally crossed paths in the fall of 1844, more than a year after their father's and brother's murders. They met discreetly at a shadow-lit restaurant in the French Quarter, where Philippe spread out his coded ledgers and Henri unfolded banking documents. Both came seeking information, but what neither expected was how perfectly their skills fit together, or how completely their shared hunger for retribution would consume the next decade of their lives. By spring of 1845, what had begun as two private investigations had evolved into a conspiracy. Philippe Deveau and Henri Rochelle weren't just chasing justice anymore, they were constructing a methodical plan to dismantle Jeremiah Aldrich using the same weapons he had wielded so effectively: betrayal, manipulation, and violence disguised as business. Unlike Aldrich, however, they would not rush. Their vengeance would be precise, patient, and devastatingly thorough. The first stage was infiltration. Philippe used his family's dwindling but lingering ties to Louisiana society to insert himself into Aldrich's world. He began appearing at the same gentlemen's clubs, political rallies, and dinner parties where the planter flaunted his rising respectability. Philippe never confronted him directly. Instead, he studied Aldrich's habits, his indulgences, his allies, his cracks. With charm and practiced ease, Philippe became a familiar face, a harmless drinking companion, never important enough to arouse suspicion, yet close enough to observe everything. Meanwhile, Henri burrowed into Aldrich's finances. Through his contacts in New Orleans banks, he uncovered the truth. Aldrich's empire wasn't built on steady profits, but on quick gains, reckless loans, and leveraged harvests. Even more damning, Aldrich had acquired a ruinous addiction to gambling. High-stakes poker tables and horse tracks drained thousands of dollars each season, losses he covered by mortgaging his future, crops, and borrowing from any lender who would listen. That weakness was the opening they needed. By 1848, Henri had secured a post at First National Bank of New Orleans, the very institution that held Willowbrook Plantation's mortgage. From that position, he subtly twisted the screws. Renewal terms carried slightly higher interest. Repayment schedules were shifted to choke Aldrich's cash flow during planting seasons. Each routine adjustment deepened his dependence and nudged him closer to collapse. At the same time, Philippe cultivated friendships with the city's most notorious gambling operators. Bribes and favors ensured Aldrich's seat at games that were rigged from the first shuffle. The other players colluded, ensuring that the plantation owner's luck turned ruinously bad, hand after hand, until he owed more than his land could possibly cover. It was an elegant trap. No confrontation, no blood, just a slow tightening of invisible ropes. By 1851, the effects were undeniable. Aldrich's debts swelled to nearly $30,000. Interest alone devoured his cotton profits. He sold off parcels of Willowbrook to cover gambling losses, and whispers spread through planter society. The man who had clawed his way into the elite was sinking fast. Under the pressure, Aldrich grew paranoid and short-tempered, snapping at neighbors, raging at workers, and thrashing for quick money schemes that only worsened his ruin. But for Philippe and Henri, financial ruin was only the beginning. They wanted Aldrich to feel what their murdered kin had felt, the choking dread of betrayal, the humiliation of powerlessness, the terror of knowing justice was inevitable. To achieve that, they needed him not just desperate, but broken, alive, but trapped. It was Henri who conceived the final act of degradation. Every planter in the South feared the specter of slave rebellion, the possibility that the very people they owned would one day destroy them. Why not turn that fear into a weapon? Not through an uprising that was dangerous, uncontrollable, but through humiliation crafted in public view. The ultimate punishment would be forcing Aldrich into a marriage with one of his own enslaved women, a union that would strip him of social standing, expose him to ridicule, and chain him to the very people he sought to dominate. They searched Willowbrook carefully for the right person, someone whose forced marriage would bring maximum shame while serving as an instrument of revenge. The choice was clear: Celeste. Celeste was no ordinary servant. At 38, she had a commanding presence, but her true strength lay in her mind and her unbreakable hatred for Jeremiah Aldrich. Purchased by him in 1847 from a failing Mississippi estate, she had been torn from her husband and 3 children, scattered across the South like chattel. Aldrich could have bought them all. Instead, he sneered at her pleas, taking only her skills as a cook and mocking her for begging. When she asked him to at least spare her youngest, a daughter of 10, he laughed coldly. "I run a plantation, not an orphanage for darkies," he told her. For 7 long years, Celeste endured. She roasted pheasants and prepared fine French sauces for the man who had shattered her family, serving delicacies to his guests while eating scraps herself. She scrubbed blood from his clothes after late-night excursions, and she watched him burn documents in her kitchen fire as he tried to erase traces of his schemes. To anyone watching, she was obedient, but behind her eyes smoldered a hatred that never cooled, and that hatred was precisely what Philippe and Henri needed, more than anyone else at Willowbrook. Celeste had mapped Jeremiah Aldrich's entire existence. She knew which dishes triggered his weak stomach, which bottles of laudanum he kept by his bedside, which corridors he paced during sleepless nights. She knew the rhythm of his temper, the patterns of his paranoia, and the private rituals he believed no one noticed. In her hands, this knowledge was survival. In the hands of Philippe Deveau and Henri Rochelle, it became a weapon. Contacting her directly would have been suicide. Any gentleman seen conferring with an enslaved cook risked scandal, suspicion, and legal ruin. Instead, the 2 conspirators worked through trusted intermediaries, free people of color, who traded in New Orleans markets and occasionally carried supplies upriver to rural estates. It began with cautious exchanges, a coin for a scrap of gossip, a banknote for confirmation of Aldrich's habits. What came back astounded them. Celeste hadn't merely observed Aldrich's decline, she had helped engineer it. She salted his meals to worsen his stomach ailments. She accidentally dropped and broke his favorite dishes. She whispered among the quarters that their master's debts might soon force a sale. Small, deniable acts that seemed like misfortune to outsiders, but which gnawed at Aldrich's sanity day by day. When Philippe and Henri finally revealed who they were, Celeste didn't hesitate. She had no illusions about the monster she served. Aldrich had destroyed her family, tearing her children from her arms and selling them into different states as casually as livestock. The thought of his ruin lit a fire in her eyes. She promised not only cooperation, but enthusiasm. Her one condition was freedom papers that would carry her safely to Canada, where she dreamed of finding her scattered children. Philippe and Henri agreed instantly. They no longer saw her as a pawn, but as a partner. Over months of careful planning, the final scheme came together. Step 1. Ruin Aldrich financially until he had nowhere left to turn. Step 2. Present him with a choice that wasn't a choice at all: marry Celeste in a legal ceremony, or face annihilation at the hands of his creditors. A union with his own enslaved cook would shatter his reputation and leave him bound to the very woman who hated him most. From there, the rest would be slow poison and a death by inches, mirroring the agony he had inflicted on their families. The opportunity came in early 1854. Henri learned of an upcoming gambling tournament in New Orleans, a gathering of men who wagered fortunes on the fall of a card. Aldrich, desperate to stave off foreclosure, planned to risk everything he had left. It would be the moment to spring the trap. The tournament was held in a converted warehouse by the waterfront, a place where smoke, whiskey, and desperation hung as thick as the river fog. On a suffocating February night, Jeremiah Aldrich arrived with a leather satchel containing $8,000, every liquid asset he could scrape together. Slaves, livestock, even heirlooms had been sold to assemble this final stake. He entered, believing he might gamble his way back to solvency. He didn't know the table was already rigged. The game was 5-card stud, stakes beginning at $500 a hand. At first, fortune teased him. He won small pots, enough to keep hope alive, enough to stoke reckless confidence. The whiskey flowed. The bets rose. Midnight came, and half his fortune was gone. Still, he pushed forward with the stubborn fury of a drowning man thrashing toward an invisible shore. By 2 in the morning, Aldrich was a wreck of sweat and nerves, staring at his final $3,000. Then came the hand that looked like salvation, a pair of kings showing, the chance of a full house glimmering beneath. With trembling hands, he shoved everything into the pot. But the others weren't ordinary gamblers, they were Philippe's puppets. The cards fell exactly as planned. Aldrich's kings lost to a cold-eyed stranger, holding a full house. The final pot was swept away. Willowbrook's master was ruined. As silence fell, the other players drifted into the fog, leaving Aldrich frozen before the empty table, staring at the space where his last hope had vanished. Only the stranger remained, his gaze steady, his words like the click of a coffin lid. "Mr. Aldrich," he said softly, a faint French accent curling around the syllables. "The men you just lost to were not gamblers. They were representatives of interests that have carried your debts long enough. Their patience has ended. Payment is due." Before Aldrich could respond, another figure stepped from the shadows by the door. Gaslight caught his face, illuminating the unmistakable features of Marcus Deveau. Except Marcus had been dead 11 years. Aldrich's blood ran cold. "You look as if you've seen a ghost, Jeremiah," the newcomer said, advancing with deliberate grace. "Perhaps you have. My name is Philippe Deveau. You knew my brother well. In fact, you were the last man to see him alive." The warehouse air, already thick with fog, seemed to choke tighter around Aldrich. For the first time in years, the predator felt the unmistakable chill of becoming prey. Aldrich's fingers trembled as the truth crashed down on him. This hadn't been a game of chance, nor a last desperate gamble to save Willowbrook. It was an execution by design, an elaborate snare that had been years in the making, sprung by men whose hatred had aged into something sharp and merciless. From the far side of the fog-draped warehouse, another figure emerged. Henri Rochelle stepped forward, his presence completing the triangle of judgment encircling the ruined planter. His voice was calm, but his words carried the weight of a noose tightening. "My father, Samuel, warned us about men like you, Aldrich. You were clever enough to spill blood and steal fortunes, but not clever enough to imagine that the dead sometimes leave behind sons who remember, and sons who avenge. The silence pressed in, broken only by the muffled horns of steamships along the Mississippi. Aldrich sat frozen, thoughts ricocheting through his mind like trapped birds. He was isolated, cornered, and penniless. If he vanished into the swamps tonight, no creditor or neighbor would even ask where he had gone. Philippe settled opposite him at the table with a deliberate slowness. His expression almost relaxed, as though savoring the moment. We know everything, Jeremiah. The Delta Trading Company, the blood money, the forged deeds, the bribes, the warehouse murders. We know it all. Henri laid a leather folio across the felt surface, opening it like a prosecutor unveiling evidence. And here are the receipts. Bank ledgers showing the accounts you pillaged, property deeds you forged, signed statements from men who helped you launder your theft, even letters from officials who once shielded you men, who would now gladly betray you to save their own skins. Aldrich's chest tightened. He recognized documents he had burned years ago, or thought he had. Pages of his past, resurrected like corpses, now arrayed before him with surgical precision. Together, Philippe and Henri had built not just a case that could hang him in court, but a weapon that could drag half of Louisiana's elite into disgrace. Philippe's voice was low, almost conversational. We could give this to the federal marshals, or to the New Orleans press. Either way, you'd be ruined, and your death wouldn't be quick. Aldrich finally rasped, "What? Do you want money?" I can raise. Henri cut him off with a bitter laugh. "Money? We already own your debts. Every note you've signed, every crop you mortgaged, every loan you begged, it's all ours. Your plantation is ash on paper. You have nothing left to bargain with but your skin." The warehouse seemed to shiver with the weight of their words. Aldrich was stripped, bare not just of wealth, but of dignity, power, and identity. Yet somewhere inside, a sliver of his pride resisted the thought of death. "There is," Philippe said, tilting his head as though pondering a kindness, "one alternative, one way to purchase a few more breaths. But it will cost you something far worse than your fortune." Henri leaned across the table, eyes glittering with cruel satisfaction. "You're going to marry your slave, Jeremiah, publicly, legally, permanently. You will stand before a minister, witnesses, and God himself, and take Celeste, your cook, as your lawful wife. You will live in her bed, walk by her side, and present yourself to society as a man who chose to wed his own property." Aldrich's mouth opened in a strangled gasp. The words were so grotesque, so obscene, he could barely process them. To marry an enslaved woman was unthinkable, worse than death, worse than prison. It was the annihilation of every shred of honor a planter could claim. "You're mad," he whispered. "No preacher would perform such a ceremony. No court would honor it." Philippe's smile was thin as a blade. "We've already secured the preacher. A minister drowning in gambling debts. He'll do it for coin. And the law is clear. Jeremiah, once vows are spoken, a contract is binding. You will be Celeste's husband until the day you die." Henri's voice dropped to a near whisper, each word a nail in Aldrich's coffin. "The choice is simple. Refuse, and you won't leave this warehouse alive. Accept, and you will live, but live as our puppet. Your name rotting while you endure the slow death we've designed." The silence stretched. Aldrich's mind raced through his two futures. A corpse dumped in the Mississippi, remembered only as a gambler who vanished. Or a living spectacle of disgrace, chained by law to the very woman he had once owned. Finally, with a broken voice, he asked the only question left. "If I agree, how long must it last?" The two men exchanged a glance heavy with cruel amusement. "For the rest of your natural life," Philippe said evenly. "Marriage is sacred, after all. Though, judging by your failing health, We suspect that life won't be nearly as long as you hope. The meaning was clear. This wasn't mercy. This was a sentence, a living death, and Jeremiah Aldrich, the man who had killed to build his fortune, now faced the only fate he feared more than dying surviving in disgrace. Let's continue unraveling this nightmare. For long minutes, Aldrich sat motionless, staring at the marriage contract as though it were a death warrant. Finally, with the resignation of a man crushed beneath an unseen weight, he lifted his eyes toward the two men who had orchestrated his ruin. If I sign, if I submit to this madness, what assurance do I have you won't simply kill me afterward? Henri's answer was merciless. None. The only guarantee is that your end will be slower and gentler than what we had first envisioned. Consider this marriage a test. Comply, and you may find moments of kindness. Resist, and you'll discover just how inventive we can be. Philippe slid a folded document across the table. Here it is, a proper marriage contract, already prepared. Tomorrow evening, at Willowbrook Plantation, you will stand before witnesses and God himself, and marry your cook, Celeste. Invitations have gone out in your name. Your neighbors believe you've had a religious awakening, that this is your idea, a gesture of Christian charity. They will see not a man cornered, but a man willingly debasing himself. It was the final cruelty. He would be forced to wear the mask of devotion, to claim this humiliation as his choice. Aldrich's hands shook so violently he could scarcely hold the pen. The contract was stark in its terms: marriage to Celeste, permanence of union, her legal rights as wife and mistress of Willowbrook, and in return temporary relief from his creditors. He scrawled his name, the ink blurring from the tremor of his hand. In that moment, he knew he had surrendered not just his fortune, but the very identity he had spent 15 years manufacturing. "Welcome to the family," Philippe said, folding the contract with a predator's smile. "Dress well tomorrow. It will be a memorable occasion." The dawn of March 15th, 1854, broke gray and oppressive. Heavy clouds pressed low, carrying the swamp's rot into the air like a sour omen. Aldrich had not slept. He paced his study until his legs trembled, pausing only to glare at the contract, lying on his desk, a silent reminder that his entire life had been reduced to a grotesque ceremony. Celeste had been told of the arrangement in advance, yet when Aldrich stammered through his explanation over breakfast, inventing excuses about debts and duty, she listened with the patient calm of a woman who had already rehearsed this moment in her mind. When he finished, her reply was terrifying in its simplicity. "Yes, Master Aldrich, I understand. I'll prepare myself. No anger, no resistance, only acceptance, cool and absolute." That frightened him more than open defiance ever could. By afternoon, Willowbrook Plantation swarmed with guests. Neighbors arrived in their finest carriages, lured by invitations that Philippe and Henri had sent in Aldrich's name. The story they had been fed was absurd, yet compelling. Jeremiah Aldrich, reborn through faith, was elevating one of his slaves to the dignity of wife. Many came expecting a spectacle, a scandal to dine out on for months. What they witnessed instead was a carefully staged wedding. The grand hall was dressed with flowers, refreshments lined the tables, and the groom stood in his finest coat, pale and sweating, yet determined to play the part of a man guided by conviction rather than coercion. When pressed for his reasons, Aldrich repeated the rehearsed lines, speaking of Christian duty, of charity, of divine calling. His voice wavered, but his performance was convincing enough that most guests, unsettled though they were, nodded along. Then Celeste appeared. She wore a simple but elegant gown, her broad frame carried with dignity and an almost regal calm. She smiled at the crowd, thanked them for bearing witness, and declared it the happiest day of her life. The irony was not lost on Aldrich. Every graceful word she spoke drove nails deeper into his coffin. The minister already, bought and paid for, cited the vows with solemn gravity. When the moment came for objections, the room fell into suffocating silence. No one dared speak, though unease rippled through the congregation like a chill draft. Aldrich's vows were whispered, nearly inaudible. Celeste's, by contrast, rang clear and strong. She promised loyalty, respect, and obedience with such steady conviction that for a fleeting instant, one could almost believe the union genuine. And then the kiss. The minister commanded it. Aldrich's face turned ashen, his body trembling as though he might collapse. But Celeste steadied him with a hand on his arm. She leaned in, her lips brushing his with a brief, chaste kiss that sealed their marriage before the law and society alike. The guests departed soon after, whispering in disbelief, shaking their heads as though they had seen the impossible. That night, Willowbrook no longer felt like Aldrich's domain. The rooms seemed alien, the very walls turned hostile. Celeste moved through the halls with the authority of one who knew she now belonged, not as servant, but as mistress. She rearranged furnishings, redirected servants, made decisions without asking permission. When Aldrich attempted to protest, she fixed him with a stare carved from years of rage and loss. Her voice was low but final. "We're married now, Jeremiah. Husband and wife, partners. It's time we act like it, don't you agree?" Later, as they lay in the same bed where Aldrich had once believed himself untouchable, he realized his tormentors had devised something far worse than execution. He was to endure a living death, a daily reminder of his weakness, forced to share his life with the woman who despised him, trapped in a punishment as suffocating as the swamp air outside his windows. The slow ruin had begun. Every meal Celeste placed before him, every gentle word, every fleeting smile, concealed a purpose. She had become the instrument of a punishment far more terrifying than the execution Aldrich once feared. For the truth was this: the wedding had not been the climax of Philippe and Henri's vengeance, it had only been the opening act. The first month of marriage passed with deceptive calm. Celeste stepped into her role as mistress of Willowbrook with an authority that stunned Aldrich's remaining neighbors. She managed the household with poise, entertained callers with unexpected grace, and preserved just enough social formality to keep up appearances. To the outside world, the marriage was strange but survivable, a curiosity whispered about, but not immediately scandalous. But inside the house, Aldrich began noticing subtle shifts that filled him with unease. His morning coffee carried a faint bitterness. His suppers, though beautifully prepared, left him nauseated and weak. Headaches bloomed like storms behind his eyes. At first, he blamed stress, humiliation, and the crushing weight of his ruined fortunes. But as the weeks dragged on, the symptoms deepened. He grew dizzy, unsteady, exhausted. Then came the collapse. During a meeting with cotton buyers, Aldrich slumped across the table, his skin waxen, his breath ragged. Dr. Hamilton Warren, the plantation's physician, was summoned. After a brief examination, Warren spoke words that chilled Aldrich more than any sermon or threat ever had. "These are the classic signs of prolonged poisoning, likely arsenic or some other metallic compound. Left untreated, the damage is fatal." The physician's diagnosis confirmed Aldrich's darkest fear. Celeste was murdering him, but slowly, deliberately, in doses measured to keep him alive just long enough to endure the full spectacle of his downfall. He began to fight back in secret. He cooked his own meals over a small fire in his study, drank only from a hidden well he alone trusted, and locked himself at night in a guest room rather than share the bed with his wife. For a time, the precautions eased his suffering, but they came with a price. Neighbors began whispering about his gaunt frame, his skittish behavior, his refusal to eat Celeste's food or even drink her wine. Guests described him as paranoid, unstable, perhaps even mad from shame over his scandalous marriage. Celeste, meanwhile, played the role of the devoted wife to perfection. She prepared lavish meals he would not touch, offered him drinks he refused, and sighed to visitors about her poor husband's decline. To outsiders, she was the picture of patience. To Aldrich, she was the architect of his ruin. The brilliance of her performance was that it weaponized his survival instincts. His refusal to eat looked like madness, not caution. His secretive behavior seemed deranged, not defensive. Even when he confided in Dr. Warren, the warnings sounded like delirium, the paranoid fantasies of a man unraveling. After all, who could believe a former slave woman capable of such precise and educated cruelty? By late spring, Aldrich was trapped in a cage no lock could open. He was right about Celeste, but the very truth of her scheme made him appear insane. He was dying in plain sight, and yet the world believed the madness was his own. The cruelty deepened. For Philippe and Henri, financial ruin and physical torment were not enough. They wanted isolation. They wanted humiliation. They wanted Aldrich to be seen as a madman destroyed by his own sins, abandoned by the same society he had fought so hard to join. The final revelation of their plan came on a warm evening in May, when Celeste announced she was hosting a dinner party to mark their 3rd month of marriage. She invited their dwindling circle of neighbors, Dr. Warren, and several local officials. Aldrich, anticipating danger, prepared in secret teething beforehand, swearing he would not touch a morsel of food or drop of drink at the gathering. But as the evening progressed, Celeste unveiled her surprise. From the cellar came a bottle of wine, sealed in dust, its age predating their wedding. She opened it before the assembled guests, poured it into clean glasses, and with a serene smile raised her glass high. A toast, she declared, to marriage, to Willowbrook, and to many more years together. The room watched expectantly. Aldrich's glass sat untouched before him, its dark surface trembling with the candlelight. Refusal would brand him insane before every witness. Acceptance might kill him where he sat. He stared at the poisoned chalice, realizing with growing horror that Philippe and Henri had orchestrated the most perfect trap of all, one in which his silence, his protests, even his survival were all paths to the same end, ruin. As Jeremiah Aldrich lifted the glass, his hand trembling, his gaze locked on Celeste across the table. For the briefest instant, her mask of tenderness cracked, and in her eyes he saw not love, but triumph, cold, merciless triumph. By then, refusal was impossible. Every guest in the room was watching. With no way out, he drank. The poison struck fast. Within minutes, fire burned in his chest, his stomach seized with violent cramps, and his throat tightened as though a noose had been drawn from within. He collapsed across the dining table, gasping and clutching at his gut. Guests rose in alarm, believing they were witnessing the inevitable breakdown of a man whose mind and body had been unraveling for months. Dr. Warren rushed forward, but his efforts were thwarted by Celeste's performance. She threw herself across her dying husband, wailing with such raw conviction that the onlookers turned their attention to comforting her rather than aiding him. While they whispered prayers for the poor widow-to-be, Aldrich lay dying beneath her weight. That was when she leaned close, her sobs masking her whisper. Marcus Deveau was my cousin, Samuel Rochelle, my uncle by marriage. For 9 years, I've worked with Philippe and Henri, waiting for this moment. You will die as they died, slowly, painfully, and utterly alone. The revelation shattered him. Celeste had never been a pawn. She was blood to his enemies. Every meal, every smile, every carefully staged moment of domestic life had been theater-crafted not just to kill him, but to prolong his terror. As darkness closed over him, Aldrich heard Celeste's wailing rise in pitch, begging God to spare her beloved husband. Neighbors held her, whispering condolences. No one doubted her grief. They were blind to the truth unfolding before them. The completion of one of the most elaborate murders in Louisiana history. At 9:47 p.m. on June 18, 1854, Jeremiah Aldrich drew his last breath. Dr. Warren, unable to prove otherwise, recorded the death as natural, brought on by exhaustion and nervous collapse. His neighbors accepted it. Only Philippe Deveau and Henri Rochelle knew the truth. Their decade-long sentence had been carried out. The funeral was crowded. Celeste wept so convincingly that the neighboring matrons offered to help her manage Willowbrook. No one suspected that the grieving widow at the graveside was celebrating the death she had helped orchestrate. But the plot had never ended with Aldrich's final gasp. Within weeks, Celeste, now his legal heir, was reminded of the mountain of debt that bound Willowbrook. Philippe and Henri appeared with contracts in hand. As executor of her husband's estate, she signed away the plantation in exchange for forgiveness of obligations she could never repay. Then she vanished. Some whispered she fled north, free at last, carrying enough money to disappear into a new life and perhaps search for her scattered children. The records of Aldrich's death raised no alarms. To the authorities, it was another sad tale of a planter ruined by misfortune and eccentricity, his odd marriage to a slave chalked up to stress and decline. But behind closed doors, in certain New Orleans parlors, another version spread. A story of vengeance, woven with patience, precision, and cruelty, so refined it became legend. Philippe and Henri had accomplished the impossible. They had executed justice in a world where courts would never have dared touch a man of Aldrich's position. They used his own greed, his own pride, and ultimately his own house as weapons against him. Willowbrook itself became the final insult. Instead of being sold, it was transformed into a refuge for runaways and freedmen, a hidden station along the Underground Railroad. The mansion that once celebrated slavery became a sanctuary for those fleeing it. And Jeremiah Aldrich, he was erased. No legacy, no heirs, no monuments. His name survived only in whispers, a cautionary tale about betrayal and the long reach of vengeance. He had been reduced from planter elite to a forgotten footnote, remembered only as a man broken by debts and a strange marriage that ended in madness. The perfect punishment, to vanish from history as though he had never lived at all. This tale shows us that justice doesn't always come from courts or laws. Sometimes it waits in silence, patient and merciless, until the guilty destroy themselves. What do you think? Was Jeremiah Aldrich's fate deserved, or did revenge twist into something darker than justice? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more tales of history's darkest mysteries, subscribe, ring the bell, and share this story with someone who loves the macabre truths buried beneath the past.